welcome to Patriarchies. And this is a work in progress, huge subject. Right now I have it in the form of about 4 visual presentations, and that's probably going to break down further as I add more detail to it, but this is its current version. And I'm going to be looking at the basis of oppression on the basis of sex. The sexual double standard, colonization of women's sexuality, reproductive power, labor, and psyches. And this intersects with a lot of other axes of domination, like ethnicity, class. They're intertwined very deeply. I'm going to be really putting the emphasis here on the sex dimension of patriarchy, because I don't think that most of us have had an education. We were never really told systematically what law has done to women, the ways that religion is used to leverage male power against women and women against each other. And so what I'm showing you here are some of the main forms that you see recurring on a global level at this point. The need or the imperative to designate paternity as the basis of social organization, and thereby, because women are the ones who bear children, then you have control of women's bodies, movements, speech, behavior, even the way women sit, the way women dress, being enforced on societal level and eventually on national and global levels. And so there's a lot of ways this breaks down, and I'm not going to be talking so much about this first layer here around male violence against women. That's a whole show in itself, and I'll save that for later because we could be here forever, all night. But we are going to be looking at how law and religion and custom enforce patriarchal control on women, on girls, on, just across the board on the entire female body. And we're going to see more about that in another webcast. I have a show that I have digitized, but I haven't fully formatted, called Taming the Female Body, that looks at veiling, seclusion, body modification, female genital excision, foot binding, corsets, all of those kinds of things, surgeries, including so-called cosmetic surgery. But the problem in doing visual talks like this, they're very important to do because you can actually experience at a more gut level what we're looking at, but that there's a lot of things that existed that we have historical record of or oral histories of that don't have a visual expression, so we don't see the killing of female infants, and we don't see the persecution of widows. And this is something that's still going on in some parts of the world today, both of those actually. Gang rape as a method of group male control over the community of women. But some of the questions that are at the foundation of what I want to share with you is the history of patriarchy, not as something that is embedded, that's biological, but something that is really a historical process, and the way that like a virus has spread through the cultures of the world. And so at the core of it is this sexual double standard, the controls that are placed on women in order to enforce paternity, masculine rights over female sexuality and reproductive power, and then also over the transmission of property through inheritance. And so to enforce this, there are social norms that code in male privilege. So men have authority and women are supposed to obey. They are supposed to be dutiful, and they are supposed to be chaste. And there's another area that I really couldn't find a lot of imagery to illustrate, but the mandate of virginity, of female chastity, is part of this sexual double standard. But all systems of domination are based on divide and conquer, and that's no more true than with women. And so we see these divisions laid down in a variety of ways. And one of the most primal is the division between female kin of a male or a group of males, the mothers and the sisters, against the women who are brought in as wives, concubines, and slaves. So they belong to different kindreds, and they have competing interests, because the women of the male kindred have rights within that kindred. But when they go out in marriage or as captives, then they don't have those rights. They are strangers, they're others, and they come in at the bottom of the social order in this new context, in a patrilocal marriage or in concubinage. And so there's other ways that division expresses itself, because in a society where men can take many wives, then you have the first wife, or sometimes not chronologically the first wife, but the woman of highest status, of highest class many times, having authority over the other wives, and including even sometimes taking over control of their children, and competition over the assignment of property between those wives. So this is legendary and proverbial in polygynous societies, the jealousy and the hatred and the spite between wives. And then two, in a patrilocal marriage, you have the mother-in-law as a dominator, just as much or even more sometimes than the husband, over the bride who comes in. And sometimes you'll see this described in modern India, for example. The mother-in-law's position is, well, you know, I had to do this as a bride, and now you will have to do that too, because I've been on the bottom all this time, and I finally have someone who I can lord it over. And there's this class dimension, which is often racialized as well. But the preferential and yet the more controlling, in some ways, treatment of high-class women against commoners or women of enslaved classes. This is a big part of a lot of the enforcements that we see. And so you have this son preference, boy preference, the mandate to have male heirs that is so heavily enforced, including casting out women, divorcing them, if they don't have sons, even though that may biologically be the fault of the father, but you know, because of the power relations, it's put on to the woman. Without sons of assured paternity, you can't have a patrilineage. And so all kinds of social force, including some very horrifying punishments, are brought to bear on women to make sure that they are policed effectively enough that the father has confidence that that child is his, that's his son, who will carry on the line. And so this is a lot of the reason for this sexual double standard as it's acted out. The requirement that no man shall have had sexual contact with the bride. So virginity standards, chastity standards, female fidelity in the case of wives. You have male authority over women. And this can not only be the husband, also the father, the brothers, male kins in general. Romans called this patria potestas, the power of the father, which was a life and death power in their system. Then, as I mentioned, with the polygynous societies and the demand that not men but women have to be faithful to their spouse. All the inheritance codes, illegitimate children, that actually means illegal children. So it's only legal. You don't really even exist in law if you do not have a father who claims you, right? And then a correlate of this is women are legal minors. Men are their guardians, and men also have unilateral privileges that are typically denied to females in these systems. So unilateral right to divorce on the part of the male, but women don't have that right. Or they lose things, like they lose their children if they exercise that right. Child custody as a prerogative, not just of the father, the entire lineage. So then when you do have a patrilineal society, and especially when a woman goes out, patrilocal marriage, goes out to the man's family to live amongst them, then what used to be called bride wealth, which could be either a type of female inheritance or even in indigenous contexts, a gift giving. There would be an exchange of gifts as part of the marriage, along with a feast. And sharing food is a very important part of these ceremonies, even in patriarchal systems. But we will see in a lot of the Indo-European societies that they all have a name for bride wealth. So kibche in Ireland, lobolo or variations on that name in the Bantu societies of Central and Southern Africa. And we see the witaman in Anglo-Saxon. This comes from a root that means to lead the bride away. So this is an exchange between father and husband. This gift is given. There's passages in the Icelandic sagas. Gudrun says at one point that I should be bought with rings. And so wealth is given. And there's a proverb about this in anthropology, not only in the African context, but others too, that women go in one direction and cattle go in the other direction. There's an exchange. This is where lobola comes in, that the basis of wealth is cattle. And so if a bride comes this way, then the cattle have to go that way. And it sometimes can be spoken of, especially in modern context, as buying the woman. But what is really the core of it is the man's line is buying rights over the offspring of that marriage, to the point where if she divorces him and goes back to her family, unless her family can return that bride wealth, the children remain with the father. And so, and then we have the Roman saying here, which we still use, giving the bride away. I'll be talking about that a little bit later. So there's a amount of legal codes that make men literally masters over women. They're the guardian, they're the wali, the different names given to this. And so here's some example of medieval European law codes that privilege the men very definitely and absolutely over women. And then here from a famous Persian epic, the high value of sons, and the kind of the war element being brought in there and made clear too. And then both the Greeks, the Norse, various different societies value male sons over daughters. And so you have female infanticide documented in different ways, and we're still seeing this problem with this huge missing, 250 million women, missing women in India and China because of the boy preference being so absolute. And so that infanticide can be direct by murder, or it can be by neglect and starvation. But I want to begin looking at the pattern of abduction, because when we ask the question, how did things come to be like this? We were often taught that, well, this is how human society is. It's always been patriarchal, and that's just human nature. But in fact, there is a very large element of raids and warfare that has to do with the degradation of women's status to chattel. And so a lot of Greek ceramic art, here's a really archaic example of it, show male warriors carrying off women. So these abduction rapes are something that are part of the Western tradition. Even goddesses are carried off and raped. All the great gods are rapists. So you have this mythic record that exists in the Mediterranean world. And that's also true in India, where you have a lot of themes having to do with abduction or kidnapping, rape of women, even symbolic rapes of women, as the beginning of war. Wars are brought about by mistreatment of women. And this happens even in where a lot of the conflict begins because of the mistreatment and abuse of indigenous women. So in the Mahabharata, there's a long story about this seizure of Draupadi. Her husband is gambling everything away, and when he has nothing left, he keeps losing. Then he starts to gamble his and his brother's lives away, and finally the last is Draupadi, who is their collective wife. This is a polygynous context in the Mahabharata. And so the winner, Duryodhana, grabs Draupadi and begins tearing off her sari, which is what you're looking at here. And so Krishna comes along in a miracle and prevents her from being laid naked. Whole story around that. Also the Ramayana, great epic of India, is turning around the theme of Rama's wife Sita being carried off by the king of Lanka. And so she is, when you're abducted, we're assuming a rape takes place under that. And this story not only was hugely influential in India, but also spread across Indonesia and Southeast Asia. So we see here in Java, the same scene, and then again here from Cambodia. So these Indic stories had a large influence in a broader area, including in regions that were not as patriarchal as India itself was in the early medieval period. And then we've got the Roman legends of the rape of the Sabine women. And, rape literally means to carry off, to abduct. And so rapine, for example, in the description of war, involves carrying off women, goods, anything, looting, basically. But the Roman foundational story is built on the rape of the Sabine women. And so this what became a model for the way that Romans celebrated marriage. And so they used to have a cry that people would say at the weddings, and they would go, Thalasio, Thalasio. And this was from soldiers carrying one of the most prized women off. And she was intended for one of the powerful generals. And men kept trying to grab her, and they were saying, no, no, she's for Thalasius. And so that became the marriage cry at Roman weddings. And this was also part of the custom, which we inherited in Europe, of carrying the bride across the threshold, which is now supposed to be really romantic. But it's actually based in a marriage by capture. So if we look in Germanic societies and other European societies too, there's an idea in the law codes themselves that we know this is going to happen. Men are going to abduct women and rape them. And so there has to be some form of reparations, and that came in the form of money. And so they would pay a fine, but because the woman had been ruined, she was now a fallen woman through no fault of her own, she was raped, then the family knew that she would not be able to get a good marriage. And so the custom, and this is not only true in Europe, but you see it also in Southwest Asian societies, of handing her over to the rapist and forcing him to marry her. So she was doomed to a life with her rapist. And this was a patriarchal solution. It wasn't something that was for her benefit, but for the quote unquote honor of the family. And so you have legal forms of marriage that was Kaufehe, purchase, bought with rings, or Raubehe, the robbery or the capture marriage. And we talked a little bit before about Wittemon. And so we see phrases in Anglo-Saxon literature about marriage as the buying of a woman. And that's something, by the way, that the Romans had as well. A coemptio marriage was a marriage by purchase. So I don't have that in here yet. Then there's another level which is not even involving marriage. It's involving abduction and sexual access to women of lords in feudal systems. And so here's a little excerpt from the Book of Odes, or the Book of Songs, from Zhou Dynasty, China. And so the maiden is expecting that she is going to be forced into sex with her lord, which could mean a husband, or it could mean actually the lord of the land that she is a peasant farmer on. So you continually see legal codes addressing this because it was a pandemic problem in patriarchal societies. And in this case, the bondmaid, this doesn't even say whether she goes willingly or not, but regardless of that, they're going to flog her. And the ordinary death penalty will not apply because she was unfree, but you notice there's no punishment for the man, whether he raped her or whether it went consensually. Only she bears the punishment. And he has to simply bring an offering. He doesn't have any physical penalties. So this marriage by capture method, a war method of carrying women off, is something that you see here. It's in Kurdistan. It's something that today, and sometimes these are actual raptures, actual carrying off of unwilling women, and many times, and maybe in this picture, she's expected to put up a fight because there's a theatrical aspect to it, that the families agree and it's a marriage that's supposed to happen, but it has to be done according to this pattern that basically, look at the gleeful expressions on the faces of the men. And sometimes it's an outright seizure. So you have some parts of Africa and Central Asia where this is still a social norm. In Kyrgyzstan, for example. And the male kin, and you can see women participating in this also in some cases. And there again, the wife-sister opposition comes into play. And they're taking her off in an automobile, no more horses. She goes to the home of the rapist husband and his family, and they try to force her into a marriage. She doesn't really have a great deal of choice because her family may not receive her back, regarding her as already having been compromised and her honor taken. And so here's a woman being browbeaten into, say, you'll be his wife, but she's already heavily leveraged here. And here again, this may be a more theatrical form of it. But the bride is supposed to resist. She's supposed to cry. She's supposed to lament. There's a lot of societies that don't even have this capture marriage method that have very strong traditions of lament for the bride, lamenting her freedom, because marriage is being portrayed as a forced thing that she doesn't really want to happen. They know that she is going to be in bondage to a male lord. And so here again, an example from Kenya, where she has no say. This is something that was agreed upon amongst the men of the different families. So there's a lot of individual abductions, but as in the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, as more and more lordly states and empires and kingdoms arose, you've got patterns of entire communities being destroyed and carried off into captivity. One of the best documented in the visual record is the Assyrian Empire, where you have lamenting women. You could see them, the hand to the forehead is one of the gestures of lamentation, being taken off, marched into Assyrian captivity. And these could be Phoenicians, they could be Hebrews, any number of peoples, the Arabians, that the Assyrians preyed upon. But we see this also in the Hebrew Bible. And so, the city shall be taken and the houses plundered and the women taken. So this is just the way it is. And even the killing of the children, women are being raped by captors who they saw themselves slaughtering their own male relatives or their husbands in some cases. And so they're dragged off to slavery. They're sold in market, or they become slave concubines to men who purchase them in the slave markets. And this took place also in North Africa. There was a lot of predation from Egypt on Nubia. And so you have lines both of male and female captives, but there's a special weight to the captivity for women because sexual assault is part of the pattern of domination. And so you have these images, which you can see also from Shang, China, I haven't put that in here yet, of bound captives. In these cases, these are all women, but you'll see men as well. I mean, the pattern at this early period of slavery is that men are killed for the most part and women are enslaved. And that shifts in various ways because as the society becomes more controlled, more class-bound, then it's easier to enslave male. A lot of anthropologists have a saying that early slavery was female slavery because of this pattern of captivity through raids and war. And so here we've got a scene from the Germanic world, the men slain, the women carried off. This is from the Celtic world in Roman times. And again, these gestures, you see them in Greek art too, the women throwing their hands up in the air, screaming for help. So the bond maiden in Ireland, she was called a kual. And the plural of that is kumala. And so the kumala became the name for coins in Ireland. It was the worth of one female slave or 2 cows. And so you can see how fundamental this was in some societies where female bondage was the unit of measure in the economies. And there's other pieces. This is much later. I mean, this is early modern, I would say, but men leading female captives by a leash, so that this becomes a norm of female existence. And then it also spreads through the European conquest. It's very difficult to document the degree to which that was the case in the Americas before that. But here's an example of native slavers from the Guarani who are taking captive women and children off to sell. And so you've got this happening also in North America with the Yamasee Wars and various slaving wars in Yucatan and Nicaragua and other places. The Vikings were doing the same thing throughout Europe, around the Mediterranean, sailing up the rivers making war. Iceland is populated by a lot of people who are descended from female captives from Ireland, as the DNA shows. And this is especially a theme in Greek ceramic painting. This is where we see a vast repertoire of scenes of soldiers grabbing women and dragging them off as sexual chattel. And so the Trojan women, there's actually a play by that name, I think it's a Euripides, showing that the even for women of high class, in this case a princess, Briseis becomes an enslaved concubine to one of the male warriors, and in fact they fight over her as who's the biggest man who's going to end up with her. But again, that gesture of grabbing her and leading her off. And so in her case, the warrior that took her had killed her father, her 3 brothers, and her husband. And then she has to share his bed through weeks and months before Agamemnon comes along and takes her away because he's a bigger general. So the Trojan woman has in turn become a metaphor for processes that are still going on now. And so here, this is showing Palestinian women in that fix where the loss of their land, the loss of their liberty, the oppression is something that continues. And we have stories of female resistance, and one of the most important is Tarpeia, a Roman woman, daughter of a general, in fact, and she threw the gates of Rome open to the Sabine warriors, and they were going to come in and avenge the rape of the Sabine women. But they despised her for being disloyal to patriarchy, as Adrian Rich calls it. And so they either threw her off Tarpeia's rock to her death, a cliff, or another version, and you see it here, they're crushing her with their shields. And the way it's told in the Roman recounting is they said they would give her what they had on their arms. And so she was supposed to have believed that that was going to be jewelry, bracelets of gold, but instead it was their shields, and they crushed her with their shields. So this abduction and rape is also recounted in Ireland. And you have the warrior Curoi raping Bla Knight, taking her off to live with him, and she conspires to kill him. Very complicated story, but anyway, the druid from that royal group grabbed her and leaped off the cliff with her because they regarded her as a wife. She had been taken fair and square in battle, and now he was her man who she had betrayed. And so judgment went against her. So you see the lack of sympathy, any kind of human feeling for what women were going through in these contexts. And so these captives become slaves, sometimes slave concubines. Really, concubine just means a woman who is subject to a man without benefit of marriage. And so this is the fate of uncounted millions, maybe billions of women throughout history. And so the Levite is traveling around, and some men come to the door of his host demanding that the concubine, no, I guess they wanted to rape the Levite. And the host was like, I can't have this man be raped, but look, here, take the concubine, and she'll go in place of this man and my own daughter. And so she's raped all night and thrown at the door in the end of the day. And so then there's a big war that starts on behalf of this, not because of the wrong to her, but because she was his chattel. Complicated story, but really, women in their own right in the Hebrew law didn't really have any value. It was only the insult to the men. So in the Greek world, you see this division between the mistress, the concubines who are enslaved, and the wives whose main purpose is that they are going to give patrilineal sons to the Greek husband. And so with the Romans too, you have this absolute impunity for the husband. She must not presume to lay a finger on you. But if she is caught in adultery, then you can kill her and there's no trial necessary. It's the absolute power of the husband in a patriarchal system. So this law, this theme continues from Roman law very directly into Spanish law. She would be delivered up into the power of the husband. If, she had been found to be unfaithful, or if he had suspected her of being unfaithful to him, but she couldn't do anything to him. So the law instead encourages her rage to be vented on the female lover of her husband. And that woman will be turned over to the wife so that she can satisfy her revenge. The husband cannot be touched. And the same thing is true in Irish law. This is so much for the matriarchy that's claimed for Celtic women in medieval times, or the Brehon laws, because the Caitmunter is the first wife, and she has status over all the concubines, and she can slap them, she can harm them, because that is the vent. And so this is the divide and conquer played out in practical terms for in the European patriarchies. And all of this domination, the rape, the battering, all the forms of male aggression were exported also into the colonies. And an argument could be made that there was already a sexual double standard in Aztec society, but Mexico is much more than Aztecs. It's much more varied. But anyway, you have this domination being documented in the Casta paintings of colonial Mexico. Now, eventually I'll have a whole section on slavery, maybe a whole slideshow on slavery, but I just want to allude to that because as slavery becomes institutionalized as a market exchange, you have rape is pandemic within that institution. It goes without saying that a slave woman is not a virgin, that she is free game for rape. And this was true across the entire world, not just in the European slave trade, but also in across the coasts of Africa and into India and many other patriarchal ranked societies. And this slaving in female flesh continues, so that the women who were taken by Boko Haram out of northern Nigeria and the women who were enslaved by the Daesh extremists in Southwest Asia, you even see the shackles and chains still in use. And that leads us to a subset. I mean, what I've described so far is clearly relations of male domination in marriage, but the explicitness of the chattel status of the wife is something that gets spelled out culturally in a variety of ways. And so marriage becomes the house of obedience. The women have to serve men. Men eat first. Women and girls get whatever's left, and that would also be classed. So, the ladies first, and then the servants, if there's anything left at all. Sexual obedience, having to yield to men however and whenever they want. Spatial subordination. I need more pictures of this, but you do have, we'll see a little bit of this. And things just around body behavior, taboos on a woman ever stepping over or climbing over a man's body, or his clothing, or even the clothing being stored. Women's clothing can never be above men's clothing. That the inferiority in legal terms of women are underlined. So servile marriage also is just acted out in the form of battering and male violence, which we see alluded to in this Greek vase painting. And I'm not going to go into this a lot. We're going to see that in another show that has to do more with male violence, another section of this series. But this concept of male lordship is something we see acted out over and over again, and it's really still present in modern patriarchy. What I say goes. And so you've got him lecturing her. He's got a rod in his hand. He can beat her legally. So that's happening. But the spatial subordination also has to do with imperatives that, for example, in Hindu protocols, a wife must touch the feet of her husband. And here you've got the theme out of the Manusmriti that even a husband without any virtues whatsoever, his wife must constantly worship him as a god. And so this is called Dokdine in Nepal, and this is from the Brahmanic tradition that spread up into the Himalayas, where, you know, she has to put her head or her hands to his feet. The feet are considered to be the lowest part of a person. It's considered dishonorable to point the feet towards someone, but when you're the subordinate, then it's natural that you will touch the feet. And this is something that you will see also children do to parents and servants do to masters. So servile marriage, she is the dominated one, and the behavior of the bride, not just in this picture, but in many others, she is not supposed to look up and look around. She has to govern her gaze. She needs to look down. Modesty actually means shame in Hindi and Urdu. Laja. Modesty means female shame. It means covering. It means looking down. It means deferring. It means not speaking in many cases. So marriage is a very different proposition for the two parties here. And they walk in a circle around the fire to commemorate the marriage. And so she's heavily veiled, her head is down, and he leads because the husband is supposed to be the leader. So that's servile marriage. And the wife kneeling before her husband, him sometimes seated on a stool, so he's above her spatially. Don't have that picture in here yet. But also he's physically much larger than her. And you'll see this sometimes in Egyptian art where the husband is 2-3 times the size of a little wife figure down there by his side. But in serving the food to him, she's supposed to kneel and present the food, and she may not eat with him. In many cases, he eats and then she will eat what is left afterwards, or the women will eat together. This is actually part of a custom in the Western Bantu societies of having pot lids that wives give messages to their husbands. And so in this case, it's an apology where she is prostrated before him, prone, to show that she's submitting to him. And so you have a very heavy weight on women to obey and to show deference within this relations of domination that is encoded into patriarchal marriage. And here again, in Uganda, the absolute right of the husband over the wives. In this case, he's got hundreds of them, but he is about to have one of his wives executed. I don't know what the story is behind that. Or the right of a man to sell a woman. Now, some of these pictures, it has been noted, are jokes, you know, but there were actual instances of wife selling at market. And you've got this idea of a halter around her neck, like you're bringing a pig or a cow to market and being examined as if, you know, this is a slave market. We have, I thought I had it in here somewhere. There's, well, I guess from the 1300s, a record of a woman being sold by her husband in this way. And this is a custom in Mexico during the dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz, where every year around Christmas, I think it is, the wives have to kneel in front of their husbands and ask their pardon for anything they had done that might have displeased him. And so this is a big joke to them, but you know, it's like, what if the woman refused to do that? Then what? And so if we look at Iran, you have this pileup of the ancient patriarchy of Iran before the Abrahamic religions, the overlay of Islam, and then the intensification of Muslim codes into the most severe forms possible. And so this woman is actually prescribing how a woman should behave. Her husband has to approve everything she does. These are all scenes from an actual Sharia court in Iran. And so the mullah is saying that, well, you know, he beat you, all right, but you went away and now he's not going to do it anymore, and you have to go back to him. And she's saying, well, what if he beats me again? Then what? You know, and knowing that time he could kill her, and then what? You know? So the women who they divorce or they are divorced by the husband, they lose their children after a certain age. I think in Iran, it's like 7 for the boys and 9 for the girls. I forget how it goes. But he has absolute rights over the children. And so if a woman divorces, much less remarried, then she loses her child. And so you see the women pleading for the right to have custody at least one of the children. And of course, these are ruthless men. They do not yield. They're enforcing what they regard to be the divine order. And so the suffering of women is just an ocean of tears in these contexts, whatever the religious system is, wherever you've got the enforcement of male rights over women and children. And that includes this special form, which is child marriage, and this is really common in patriarchal societies. Among European, you've got this child bride getting married to the English King Richard II, but you see it all over the world even now. And so again, the differential between the young husband, he's only 14 himself, but the hanging head of the completely shrouded little bride. And so this is not only typical for India, but we see it in Catholic law. These are the same exact ages that were canonical for marriage before they reformed the law in 1917, which was the same year in the Ottoman Empire, where they set the minimum age of marriage at 12 for boys and 9 for girls. And so in halacha, in Jewish law, 12 years and 1 day is the minimum age for brides. So this is basically what was regarded as the onset of puberty. It may not have actually started in reality at that time. And the same age was also set in Hindu law, but later on you see that being stretched so that the fear was that a girl would lose her virginity. If she got much older, she would be tempted into sex and she would be ruined. So they began to require earlier and earlier marriage for girls in India. And we see here also in Yemen, can be married at 9. This is also the age in Iran, as we'll see in a minute. So in Afghanistan, the Ba'ad custom means that disputes between families are set by the male elders. And this can be a debt that wasn't paid. It can be a crime that a brother committed that is going to be taken out on his sister, who is given away as a child, as to wife, to the enemy family. So you can see what a huge penalty that girl is going to pay for the rest of her life. This one looks like she has some inkling of what she's in for. And this one is even younger. I mean, there's still a man that's, what is that, 7 times her age, not knowing at all what's in store. And so this idea of the purity of the girl must be ensured by marrying her off before she errs and strays from the path and thereby dishonors the family. So this is regarded as a kind of insurance. And this is given actually for the female infanticide, a reason for female infanticide before Islam in Arabia. And some of the sources are saying it is the fear that the daughter would bring dishonor on the family while she's still young before marriage and be found not to be a virgin that caused fathers to bury them alive or to kill them in some other way. So the Ayatollah Khomeini says 9th birthday, that's the cutoff point. And if he marries her earlier and rapes her, inflicting traumatisms upon her, what's the penalty? He has no right to repeat such an act with her. There is no penalty. This is the enforcement of religious law. So, and then without marriage, in some of the excision cultures, you have a custom of allowing girls to have lovers. Look how young they are, up until the point of their initiation, at which point they undergo excision, marry, and now they are very heavily policed to remain faithful to that husband. So they're allowed this period of, if you can call that freedom. I mean, they're so young and those are grown men. So this leads us back around to boy preference in all the ways that families used to get rid of girls, whether it was directly killing them or selling them off. And so infanticide, sometimes the child would not directly be killed, but she would be neglected, she would be starved, the boy would be fed and be fat and happy, and the girl barely has the strength to hold her head up. And so women are participating in this system because they're rewarded for sons. And so you have massive female infanticide in China, which I alluded to before. And it was not an uncommon thing to see girls abandoned in this way. There's about the sale of daughters in Japan during the 1930s, and typically they are winding up in brothels and working in the streets. And so this use of slave girls is something you see economically very strong in China. So when you see pictures like this, our assumption these might be daughters, but they could also be slave concubines. They can be servant girls who basically were slave concubines. And then the other thing that happens is with patrilocal marriage, she goes to live with the husband. And so when the family arranges a marriage with a foreigner, and during certain periods, it became necessary to establish friendly relations with the nomads of Central Asia, then the young Chinese girl could be sent hundreds or even maybe 1,000 miles away from home to live out the rest of her life among another people. So they would just be cut off for the purposes of the family's wealth or even for political bases. And so this is from Revolutionary United States. And the advice is, keep within compass, and you shall be sure to avoid many troubles which others endure. And so who are these others? They are the women who are being arrested as streetwalkers for being out in public at night, who are thrown into prison. And so stay inside the lines that we have laid for you. They're narrow, but there you will be safe. And that's the big lie of patriarchy, is that if you just obey and play by the rules, everything will be all right. You'll be well treated. But this is a lie.